Hey guys, it's Matthew again. Today I'm bringing you something a little different. This is a speed paint I was working on. Firstly, I want to apologize. I actually did record all of the progress I made on this, like individually each part. But I ran into a bit of a problem when I stitched them together, mainly because I tend to rotate the canvas a lot. I'll explain why a bit later. But it became a bit of an issue because when I sped it up, um, it wasn't watchable. It was just lots of spinning, pretty much. So, but there is another method I saw. I'll get into as well. But yeah, it was a bit of an issue of if I had it at a decent time range, but a really fast speed, it was unwatchable. But if I had it at a regular speed where you could watch it like this, then it would be way too long. So anyway, I kind of found a middle ground. I stitched some parts together, so it's essentially it'll black out and skip a couple of hours of progress. But that's right, a lot of it's just refining, and I'll get into that. Um, Yeah, so that's essentially the main gist of it. So I guess I'll get into it. If you don't want to watch the entire thing, because it still is quite long, you can skip near the end, um, where I've done a kind of overall progress. So I had like passes where I saved out images from previous takes. So a couple of hours you put in that one, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so you can skip to the end if you want to see that. Otherwise, I'm just going to be giving you tips and little things I've learned over the years while drawing throughout this video. So yeah, let's get right into it. So firstly, you might have noticed I've already done quite a bit now, but here I started out with line work. I just sketched out overall forms, and that gave me a pretty good starting point to kind of get shapes and characters in there and motions. And then I went over and started blocking out basic lighting. Now, it's very important. I know I'm a bit hypocritical saying this because I've been, done the opposite essentially before. Is zooming out when you're doing this sort of thing, because if you zoom in, it's very easy to get lost in the detail, and you can spend hours working on this one person's face and then realize that it doesn't work with everything else. So always, if you can, try and keep your screen zoomed out as much as possible, or so you can see most of the things at the canvas. Like 70% is probably the furthest you'd want to zoom in, so you can see 70% of the canvas. So yeah, you don't get stuck in that trap of doing too much detail in one area and realizing it doesn't work. And secondly, always remember that nothing is a final pass. Yeah, not even when you're nearly done is it a final pass. Just remember, everything can change. It doesn't have to stay the way it is. For instance, two of these characters change completely by the end of this, and everything, at least everything in here, is scaled differently or moved around. Proportions are changed, etc., etc. So remember, nothing stays as it was essentially, or that's at least how you should be painting. Is trying to view things and trying to make it look better, not just trying to stick with what you first did and make that look as pretty as you can. So yeah, that's kind of my overall how I go about doing artwork. That's the main gist of it. And here, as you can see, I'm just adding more detail in the refinement, the lighting. I've always been pretty terrible with fabric, I guess, but if you're having a little bit of trouble, use a reference image. I don't use enough. I really should use more for cloth because I'm pretty bad at it. Um, but essentially, if you're wanting to do cloth, just remember there's points where creases fall towards, like little choke points, I guess you'd call it, like around knees and elbows and shoulders, little points where the creases kind of point towards. That's the main gist of it. But again, I need to. You should probably look at references. That's the best place to get things right. Whenever I have major trouble with something, I usually get a reference image or something to fix it up and make it look correct. I've done that twice here. Two things looked horrid to me, and so I've changed them and fixed them up. It's okay for things to look bad in the first pass. That just goes in hand with what I was saying before. You don't have to get everything perfect from the get-go. It's okay to make mistakes. So here I'm just working on the flag at the moment. I'm trying to get the perspective correct because it didn't look right to me at that point. The pole didn't feel straight, so I was just marking out a line so I know exactly where it goes. And yeah, here I'll be adjusting the proportions quite a bit. I'll be warping some parts using the transform tools. It's always good to go back and adjust because things you do in the first pass aren't always correct, and that's okay. It's fine for them not to be like perfect when you begin. It's just the whole process of cleaning up, refining, and yeah, that's the whole gist of it. You might notice as well, I do tend to rotate the canvas quite a bit, as I said earlier, and the reason why I do that is to get a different perspective on my piece. Because I used to do that quite a bit when I used to draw on pencil and paper. It's just something I did to view it from different angles. Because something might not look quite right from a different angle. And I flipped the canvas in this one. I think I already did it. Yeah, I believe I did it already in this shot. But essentially what that does is the second you flip a picture you're working on, it might not be quite obvious, but when you before you even do it, there could be a little mistake that you can't see from that specific angle. The second you flip it, it will be a glaring issue. It will look funny, and I've had this multiple times. Like, I've flipped a picture before, and a face has looked really warped and distorted from that angle. And I mean, at first, when I first did that sort of thing, I kind of I tried to avoid that and just said, I'll just make it look good in the angle I had originally. But that's not the way to go. It's much better to fix that from different angles and get it looking good in all angles, like flipped or not flipped. Reason for that is it might look fine to you, but someone else might see that mistake you've made, and it would, irritate them. So it's always good to fix these kinds of problems. Yeah, so you just gotta try and look for these sort of issues when you're doing art and try and fix them as you go. So that's the main gist of things. So here I'm just rendering the boat, just straightening out lines, trying to get perspective right. It's again making mistakes, cleaning them up, fixing them. And here going through, I probably fixed up the sail here. I wasn't quite happy with how the wind was affecting it. I didn't really have an idea of where the wind was coming from to begin with, which is kind of a mistake. You probably should think about these things, just like lighting. Lighting is extremely important. I really should have marked it down to begin with, got like a rim lighting, a foreground lighting, etc, etc. There's that 3-point lighting setup, which is really good for getting great looking lighting. I find a rim light really makes a piece look good though. If you want just to do basic lighting, try and add a rim light. Rim lighting does make a big difference. And here I'm just adding some mist to separate Geralt from the background characters, because they felt a bit clashing, like they were clashing for attention, and they still are, but a lot less so. So adding some mist is a good way of separating. Yeah, so I tried to add some creases to the mast between the last two passes, but still not quite happy with mast. And sometimes if I'm having trouble with something, I work on something else, and that's a good idea for if you're really stuck on something. Just work on something else for a while, get that looking great, and then work back on what you're having trouble with. And you'll find it a lot easier once you've stepped away and worked on something else for a period. So here I'm just cleaning up, just adding highlights, tweaking shadows and adjustments, all that. Again, failing and attempting to get cloth folds working. Yeah, lots of that. Unfortunately, for things like cloth, I often have several attempts to get it right. So it takes me a little longer to get folds right, but I'm getting better. I've had some issues in the past with folds, but I think I've improved quite a bit since I started those. Here I'm just trying to attempt different lighting on the face. It doesn't end up working too well in the end. Like a light from the bottom, but that's fine. Again, as I said, trial and error is a great way of making something look good. Give something a go. Even if you just think it might not work, just try it, and who knows, you might like it. For instance, like in the line work stage, between the first and second pass of this video, I actually did refine line work, and I added a bunch of random details, different like little design choices, and they made a big difference. But some of those things were taken out because I've redone two of the characters here, but that's fine. It's always good to do trial and error. There's no harm in it, and it can make a huge difference in the end. So yeah, just again, fixing up the form. It's always good to sketch out form. Often I try and work on the one layer, but I have a layer where I experiment and then just merge it down once I'm happy. That's something I often find that works. Some people work differently, like others will have 100 layers, and that's kind of how I started out, and other people work in like 2 layers, and it's fine. It's what works best for you is important. I just find if I have too many layers, I kind of muck around trying to adjust or find layers, and it can get a bit monotonous. So I find it's just simpler and just works better for me to have less layers, if I can help it, of course. Again, just adjusting lighting. A good little tip as well, for back when I was talking about the mast for the boat, perspective is really tricky. It's hard to get it right, and it's way easier to just completely get it wrong. I suggest doing 1-point or 2-point perspective first, kind of getting a hand of how perspective works. Otherwise, I've seen some really good concept artists. Mikkel Kuss, I think it is. Pretty bad at pronouncing names. He, one of my favorite concept artists or illustrator. He tends to draw lines out first. Like he'll mark down several lines to get a base perspective going, and then he'll build on top of that. He does a lot of vehicle designs and line work around that, and he actually gets perspective looking really amazing, and that's because he sets up these guidelines first. So it really helps them out. Here I'm using the liquify tool under filters. Really useful tool for if you're just adjusting. Yeah, so I suggest using liquify. It does help quite a bit. Yeah, but back on to what I was saying about Mikhail Kuz. Yeah, if you can, I suggest trying out doing some marking out lines for perspective lines. So, for instance, mark one perspective point somewhere and draw out some lines pointing to that line or that point, and use those lines you got as guides to put edges and shapes into your objects. Here I'm just adjusting the lighting. Really important as well, I don't often work in grayscale. I haven't really done it a lot, but I think it's a good little method. Whether or not it's better than using base colors to start off with, or grayscale to start off with and then color it later, that's completely up to you. I don't think there's one better method. Grayscale is good for blocking out lighting first, getting lighting right, and then worry about color. But to be honest, I haven't done it a whole lot, but I prefer to work in color first, if it was my preference. Some people will have the opposite preference though. I think it's completely up to the person doing it though, whether or not it works for them. However, if you're trying to do grayscale, you got to understand how color works with black, white, and gray. So essentially, if you look at my color picker on the right side, there's the color, then there's white, and there's black. Black on the left, bottom left, and white on the top left, and the color on the top right. If I was to turn that color picker into grayscale, so it was zero saturation in that color, that blue would be 50% gray, like exactly. So between white and black, that middle point, that value is the same grayscale value as that light blue in the top right corner. It might not look like it, but that's the value. So you've got to consider that when you're doing painting. It's best to avoid blacks and whites when you're painting grayscale. Got to keep that in mind. It's very important. If you use black, you can't add any color to it, and if you've got pure white, you can't add any color to that. So keep that in mind if you're doing using color. That being said, though, I do use the mode overlay, and that kind of does change the grayscale values a little, but I think as a good method itself, try to avoid using blacks and whites, because in nature there isn't a lot of blacks and whites. Even in a dark, not very well lit room, you'll be hard pressed to find any blacks. Most of the time it's just dark grays. So keep that in mind. Even dark grays you can add color to. So yeah, I highly suggest trying to avoid whites. Anything above like 90% or 90% white, or 90% black. Try to avoid anything darker than that, the 10% figures. But if you're doing like final touches, it's okay to add some white here or there and some blacks if you need to. But just as a rule of thumb, it's good to avoid them. I tend to work using the colors on the actual canvas I've already got. I think it's a good little method. It's faster for one, but also it stops me from using too dark or too light colors. So yeah, keep that in mind. Yeah, pretty much just avoid blacks and whites if you're trying to do a grayscale to color. Because I actually made that mistake when I started. My first black and white piece, well, grayscale piece, I pretty much used blacks and whites, and I ran into that issue where I couldn't color it because it just wasn't working for me. So here I'm just cleaning up, trying to remove any black line work I had already. I tend to paint over my black line work and just try and remove it as I paint. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, because it means the part where there is line work is parts you haven't cleaned up yet. It's kind of a reminder you haven't gotten around to that point. So I think it's okay having some line work in there, and it also defines objects a little. You can help it work to your advantage in painting form on characters and shapes. So try and use that line work to your advantage if you want to paint with line work. I think it helps, but sometimes I don't even use line work. Sometimes I paint just directly, like using greys. I don't even bother with black line work sometimes. But line work is great for blocking out forms, for sure. Recommend using it. Again, just going around, I'm considering where my light source is. So currently I have it at the back right, a stronger light source. Then there's like an ambient light around the characters, so nothing's too dark, but the main light source is behind them to the right. That being said, I probably should have marked out where my lights were exactly and had multiple different light sources. So, as I was saying with rim lighting, you might have like a yellowy white color at the back right for rim lighting, and then at the front you might have like a cold blue light. That gives it a bit of depth. Lighting makes a huge difference to a piece. I can't illustrate how important lighting is. If you don't get it right, it doesn't look realistic. And yeah, so just keep that in mind. Lighting is very important, and always use reference images to get it right. So yeah, just refining the light and the line work here. Just marking down where I think stitches would be in this guy's gloves. And it's always good, as I just did just then, to zoom out and look at your piece from a whole. Because sometimes if you're focused in on that one piece, you might add way too much detail in this little portion, and then if you zoom out, everything else might not have enough detail, and it's good to look at your piece as a whole to judge how the piece is coming together. Just adding some weathering effects, so like little cuts, rotating around it to look at it from different views. And here I reduced the size of the guy on the left because I felt he was too dominant, and yeah, he needed to be changed. Here again, just marking down some colors, making sure there's no holes, but not worrying too much about detail, which is good when you're making changes. I wouldn't worry too much about making it look perfect to begin with. I'd worry about making the change. So here I'm completely redoing this guy's head, and I'm using colors that pre-exist on the guy on the left there. As I said before, I like to work with colors that already exist in the canvas. I think it really helps, or in this case, grayscale values. Just blocking down some lighting effects. Again, painting over the top of the line work. Can be a little tricky, painting over the top of the line work, but once you know how to do it, it's a good little method of getting some form in. Just blocking down some lighting. As you can see, we've gone a few steps ahead, so there's quite a bit of detail in Geralt and the guy on the left there at the back. Nothing too much more to say, other than just looking at the piece as a whole and judging what needs to be changed. So like this guy on the left here I'm redoing now, I was not happy with that character initially. It just didn't work for me. His perspective wasn't quite right, and he didn't feel realistic enough to fit in with this piece. So I decided to just completely redo him. Likewise, I drew a similar thing with Geralt. His pose feels extremely static to me. It doesn't feel like he's moving or wants to move or he's going to do anything.
And I ended up changing that, and I'm really happy with the final result just because I um, considered and thought about how it looked and how much of a change it would make. And so just by thinking about that and giving it a trial run, so like I made a layer and I could turn it off if I wasn't happy with it, um, made a huge difference because I was very close to not doing it. I was very close to leaving it the way it was. And you can also see I've changed the sail a bit. So now there's a bit of wind on that mast pushing against it. Probably soon we're going to jump ahead and we're going to see quite a bit more detail in the guy on the left. I've given him eyebrows and more markings around his face, wrinkles, things like that. But having that baseline there is very helpful for adding extra details. So, as I said, mark down your details first, like the base forms. No extreme details like wrinkles, pimples, don't worry about that. Just worry about marking down the lighting first, and then add details. So, now that I've got a bit more of a strong lighting setup, I'm adding wrinkles, things like that, and cleaning up edge work. A lot of that. So yeah, the ear, if you look at that, is very simple. Doesn't look very nice, but that's okay, because I changed it. So here we are. I took a picture of myself, and well, actually recorded myself, and went through the recording to find a good pose that would suit what I wanted. I was just holding like a paper roll, and I just turned it into a sword. But made a huge difference for me. It gave him intent. He's looking where he wants to strike, and he's getting his weapon ready, kind of like a batter at cricket or baseball, something like that. He's got the intent, so it looks like he wants to move. And now I'm just painting directly over the top of it. I'm not even going to bother with the line work at this stage. I'm just working on trying to get some armor in there and make him look like he's, the guy on the right. I've also, at this point, I'm changing the design a little because there were some things that felt a bit like their details didn't quite feel like they would fit in the universe that Geralt lives in. So I tweaked it to make it feel a bit more realistic. So like his shoulder pads, his armor, his leather belt, things like that. I've tweaked them a little. But yeah, otherwise, mainly at this point, just painting over the top. I think painting over the top of an image is a good little trick to get some nice details across. But again, using this reference and painting over the top of it helped me a ton. And later I'll have that image next to the character to kind of get an idea of lighting and make sure I didn't stray too far from that reference. Because when you're painting over the top of something, it can be very easy to completely get it wrong. So yeah, having that reference to reference occasionally can help quite a bit. Again, just adjusting the lighting, making sure it looks good. Soon I'll be tweaking his face, because obviously my face does not look like Geralt's, so we got to adjust that. And I got the original right next to it, so I can just reference it for armor details, things like that. Changed up the belt a little bit, so there's not two of them, because two felt a bit funny to me, so decided to change that. Adding a belt for the I'm just blocking in just a basic form first, and then I'm adding lighting to it. And the face looked horrid to me after I did it. Originally I was just zoomed in, focused on the detail. I fell into the detail trap. I was too zoomed in, I was too focused on the things I was doing, and I kind of got carried away and wasted a lot of time on it and decided, no, this isn't working. So this is when I got another reference image, and I'm using that to block out Geralt's face, and that helped me out majorly in the future. I actually looked at a couple references online to get lighting right, things like that. Um, and as I'm blocking this line work, some things I'm not quite noticing, like this doesn't look quite right to me at this point, but I'm not sure what is affecting it. That's why like sitting back and looking at your piece as a whole before you continue is a good idea. So I judge that like the lips are too low. They feel his lips just, too close to his chin. So I adjust that, but and that makes a huge difference. Sometimes there's just one little point that the perspective is slightly off, and that can just screw it all up. So you just got to find those little points and fix them. Just going through, adjusting the lighting, blocking in lighting over the top of the line work, adding shadows, all of that. It's all pretty important. Getting lighting is quite difficult to get right, but I actually do another pass later on where I add a stronger rim light to the whole thing, and it makes a huge difference to the piece. It does change the feel quite a bit if you got lighting. Like lighting can set the mood, set the kind of feel for it. Something else, I don't think I talked about it. If you want to shift focus on a specific area, I don't use this enough, but I really should. A great idea, so if you want, say, if I wanted Geralt to be the main focus of this image, there's 3 different things I could do to it. Number 1 is reduce the detail on different things, so like the guy on the right, he might have really complicated pants, he might have some checkered pattern with crisscrosses all over it, and so if I wanted Geralt to be the main focus, I'd just simplify his pants majorly, and it would shift focus away from that, because people look for detail, they look for contrast and interesting factors, so removing that from different areas and adding it to the primary focus is a good way of focusing on one specific character. And concept artists will use this on characters, so to shift focus from below their legs up to their torso, so they might have a detailed chest piece but really simple pants or something. Another method is increasing contrast, so using more blacks and whites on the main focused character, but not full blacks and whites, but just more extreme colors on the main character, or more extreme hues and values. So if your character is a good example is like mist is a good way of doing this. So if you have a really foggy landscape, the more fog behind it, and the less focus you'll have on the characters behind. So if you've got a really foggy map, that guy who's submerged in fog, you're not going to look at him straight away. You're going to look at him last, because he has the least contrast. He's the most, say, like grey value out of everyone there that's in front. So using contrast to your advantage is a good way to make characters have more focus. And finally, the third way is using color. If you've got a really vibrant color on the main focus, people are going to look at that first over the desaturated, less interesting colors around the place. So if you've got a vibrant yellow shirt, like a, one of those workers wearing fluorescent yellow, people are going to look at that first if it's really bright and easy to see. But that can get very extreme very quickly. Some artists do an amazing job of it and handle it really well, but if you don't handle it well, it can be very easy to muck up. What I'm doing here is blocking in the sky. I'm just painting over everything. I'm not worrying about line like edges, not worrying if it crosses over. I'm just trying to get the overall form first. It's like how I started. Then I'm worrying about that later. But it's important to get like your main form blocked out first, and then worry about things like line work. So yeah, I'm just painting in big splashes around the place. and making a stronger light source around my character to draw more focus to him. So at the moment I'm just using a mask to get rid of a lot of the unneeded air, like the unneeded sky. I don't need it on his face, I don't need it around the guy at the back. So yeah, that's a good little method. And now here I think I'm doing the color. That's the final grayscale. I just went over with a gradient map. Great little method you can use. And then I'm using overlay to add some nice color. Now I was kind of experimenting here, because to be honest, I haven't done it too much. I was just looking at some tutorials to kind of get an idea of how that sort of thing works. So I'd look around and look at some methods. And a good little method I found was actually coloring the character whole first. So like for this guy, I want to give him a warm hue. So I went over him with like a brown, his whole character. And then I went in and used overlay to add more colors to other pieces of his armor. And that really separated him from the background. Because at the moment, if you look, he kind of blends in with the sky, which is not what I want. I don't want him to be a part of the skybox. I want him to feel separate, like an actual character in that scene. And so that really helps. And I think I just set that with a color. If you're wondering how I do it, I'll do it in a sec. But currently he's set up in like a folder structure, Geralt. All his color, like shades, black and white shades are in a folder. So I used Alt, so it only paints on his in like the folder contents. And there you go. I added like a brown hue to him, and now he feels like he pops. He really stands out because blue contrasts with warm, like cold contrasts with warm colors. And there you go. That's how I went about coloring this whole piece. Now I added like the rim lighting, and I'm going around cleaning it up, adding more detail to it. It's very important to get this part right, because lighting. If you get that wrong, it can wreck a piece. So always focus on getting lighting looking nice. Just go around and block in the details first, and then clean them up as you go. So, like what I'm doing, erasing what I previously did and cleaning it up. So I'm adding a bit of lighting to his cheek, so some light might have bounced off his sword onto his face. Things like that. You got to kind of get an idea of how lighting would affect him in a real world scenario. It's okay if it doesn't look perfect to begin with, but just as long as you get it looking alright, that's the main idea. Again, more adjusting, and more getting the lighting working right. I'm trying to make this a really harsh light, so that means there's less bleeding, less gradient, so really sharp to the point lighting, which means that if you're, say, doing standard kind of lighting, it affects a surface like pretty evenly. It just blends over the surface, whereas I want this lighting to be really harsh, so I want it to be really strong and intense, but not cover a wide area. So if you look, just this thin line, and that's it. It's like all that one value of light, and that's a good way of getting a rim lighting to work. Rim lighting looks nice if it's really strong and intense. And here I'm just adding a bit of texture to the chainmail, because yeah, the chainmail feels, if I just had a straight flat line, it would feel flat, and chainmail had some texture to it, so sometimes it's good to look at reference images to get an idea of how that works, which is what I did here, and that gives it a more chainmail-y look to it. Again, just cleaning up, refining line work. And if you look up top, I actually have marked down colors that I can just color pick and put that on a layer. So like GLD stands for gold. I just marked down some useful colors there. SKN for skin. All pretty useful stuff to have. Just erasing around the place. This lighting doesn't affect like that sword, for instance, evenly. The lighting might be more intense on one side of the sword, and I find adding a bit of gradient to it really helps. And lighting, you got to also consider how lighting affects different materials. So metals is going to be a bit more intense than say a flat leather. So yeah, that whole metal surface is one flat plane. It'll all have even lighting, whereas like a round face will have different lighting to that flat metal face. Alright, and here's the progress. So these are the different passes I did on this piece. You can kind of get an idea of how it changed and developed. And this is good if you just skipped ahead to, you can get an idea of its progress if you didn't watch the whole thing. I think in this piece the grayscale is just as strong as the final piece, in my opinion. It just holds up really well in comparison. Not sure what I like about the grayscale versions, but they just really work for me as a final piece. And that's the final. So it's been a fun little journey. 41 hours, so quite a long time. But I'm quite proud of where I got it, as fan art goes. I've been wanting to do a Witcher piece for a while. So yeah, thanks for sticking with me this in this quick draw. That's all. So give it a like if you want. Have a really good day, and that's all. So I'll see you later. See you in the next vid. Bye.